Yeah,
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Tates, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are, of course, in Treaty 1 territory, that is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Innuit, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the launch of Rethinking Free Speech by Peter Ives. We're very grateful to our good friends at Fernwood Publishing for bringing this book into the world and for partnering with us to make this launch a possibility, and to all of you for joining us both physically here and also virtually as well for all those watching at home. To give you a sense of how tonight will flow, there'll be a presentation from Peter here at the podium before he joins host Jason Hannan for a more wide-ranging discussion with stools to my left. Following that conversation, as time permits, there'll be an opportunity for all of you to ask questions. So please do allow those to percolate over the course of the evening. During the Q&A, if you just put up your hand, I will approach you with this wireless microphone in what is hopefully a non-threatening manner. And then you'll be able to put your questions to Peter. The microphone is not because we don't trust you to project, it's just so those watching at home can hear your questions as well. And I'll be back at the end with some absolutely thrilling details on how you can get books signed. But for right now, I have the great pleasure of introducing both of tonight's guests. Host Jason Hannan is professor in the Department of Rhetoric, Writing, and Communications at the University of Winnipeg. His work explores our digital culture wars and the politics of truth. He is the author of Trolling Ourselves to Death, Democracy in the Age of Social Media, published by Oxford University Press, which won the 2024 Irving Goffman Award from the Media Ecology Association. Our guest of honor this evening, Peter Ives, is professor of political science at the University of Winnipeg. He is the author of Gramsci's Politics of Language and Language and Hegemony in Gramsci, and co-editor of Gramsci, Language and Translation, and Language Policy and Political Theory, making this the most times, to our shame, Gramsci is never mentioned. He is published in Rethinking Marxism, Political Studies, Critical Review of International Social and Political Philosophy, and Language Policy. He researches and writes on the politics of global English and bridging the disciplines of language policy and political theory. He has contributed articles to The Conversation on free speech and academic freedom, was on the editorial board of Rethinking Marxism for a decade, and was on the editorial collective of Arbeiter Ring Press, now colloquially known as ARP or ARP, for many years. Please give a very warm welcome to Peter Ives.
Thank you all so much for being here. It's so delightful to see so many people and so many old friends and new friends. And thank you so much to McNally Robinson. More than just a fabulous bookstore, all these events that they hold are just truly fabulous. And John Ives for all his, both his introduction and also all his organization. And Fernwood Press is fabulous. And my editor at Fernwood, Fiona Jeffries, is also been wonderful to work with, and any of you looking to publish a book, I would certainly recommend Fernwood. It's been excellent. So I want to begin tonight with the last sentence of my book. So I write, to reap the benefits from free expression in all its dimensions and meanings, we must learn to engage in a good way, in mino bimadzun. And my copy editor actually rearranged that sentence so the last word could be the Anishinaabe word of in a good way. And I start that as a settler, not only because I sort of learned from Indigenous organizations that they want their events to be in a good way, and I want this night to be proceed in a good way, but also because I think it sort of speaks to part of the frustrations I have with discussions of free speech, which are often very antagonistic, and it has become weaponized. It's a cudgel that people use in arguments to battle down their opponents. And to some extent, the book is about how we got here with this concept of free speech. If you look at the American election campaign just last week, but the whole campaign, numerous times a great example of both sides were saying the other side was bad for free speech. And yet there's some substance to analyze, what the criticisms were, but it was, clearly being weaponized to the point where it didn't mean anything. And certainly the situation in the US is not unique. One of the themes of the book is that we often import the dialogues about free expression from the States and the controversies into Canada in a context which is very different. The legal structure is different, and the book sort of points that out. Our charter right to free expression is quite different than the First Amendment. Our Supreme Court has made different judgments than the American Supreme Court. And yet we often import those issues. Most recently, and the book was fundamentally finished before the terrible events in Gaza. But although I do, in the conclusion, talk about the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, so the connections are sort of there, and Fernwood was good enough to allow me to make a few last minute changes to speak to those issues. But I do, in chapter 3, talk about academic freedom and free speech. And that's a key point in that the governments of Doug Ford in Ontario and Jason Kenney, when he was Premier of Alberta, enforced the Chicago principles on universities there, right? And the Chicago principles are very much a free speech absolutist document produced by the University of Chicago that placed free expression above other needs, like the comfort of students, like respect, like the feelings that students might have. And it was in the context of telling students that there might be a white supremacist speech on campus, but if you're racialized, you should just ignore it or rebut it, right? And those are your choices. And that's clear in the Chicago principles. If it's a trans talk, an anti-trans talk, similarly, the two responses are more speech or the sort of sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me approach. And yet, certainly the protests, the pro-Palestinian protests, it's irony is not the right word, but it was at the University of Calgary where the pro-Palestinian protesters were summarily, and before they could even set up the encampment, the police were brought in, right? So it's that type of thing that, yet the Chicago principles were nowhere to be seen in those discussions. We'll see what about the court cases that come out of them. So, obviously these are very important and pressing ideas. To some extent, the book starts with a fairly assumed or accepted distinction between free expression as that which is in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms or the First Amendment, and it's the notion that we are free from government infringement upon our right to express ourselves, which is very different from a lot of our discussions of cancel culture and public discussions and free and open and critical and diverse dialogue. And again, most people will accept that there's a distinction here, and yet the book shows how often that is the first part that gets weaponized. But the book takes that basic distinction and takes it further. And I look at the answer to the question of why is free speech important, right? And that is answered. I was sort of stunned to find how common it is, both in academic work as well as in popular discourse. So, for example, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, on their website, they say, why is free speech important? And they give the same 3 reasons that many academics give, which is 1, the pursuit of truth and knowledge, 2, the need for democratic self-governance, and 3, and this is sort of the more gut level notion, which I think actually characterizes many more of the sort of social media discussions of free speech, which is a gut level of I'm human, I need to express myself, right? Most of the time, and this is both in the academic literature as well as in the more serious public discussion, there's a notion that these 3 different reasons for free speech are harmonious and we can just move on. We can say the 3 and then move on and talk about free speech, whereas this book goes through and looks at the key philosophers who have sketched out each of these positions, John Stuart Mill being the most well-known and the one who always comes up in free speech debates. So I spent a fair amount of time on his work. in that notion of the production of knowledge and truth. And then the argument is that actually these produce different conceptions of free speech, which are certainly not always harmonious and quite often are at odds. And the other thinkers, Alexander Meiklejohn and Edwin Baker, explicitly reject the other thinkers, right? So the idea here is that there's a tension, and this means that our conception of free speech or free expression is different depending on what your answer to the question of why free speech is important. And they don't sort of harmoniously fit together. And then they have different scopes, right? And so depending on which answer you privilege, you have a different scope and a different set of divisions on what free speech is. So that's sort of the core of the first 2 chapters. I go into other things like the famous metaphor of the marketplace of ideas and those types of things, the Supreme Court decisions. And then chapter 3, I move on to the issue that really sparked this book. So most of you might have repressed or forgotten the events of Lindsay Shepherd in 2017 at Wilfrid Lorraine University. But this was a TA who showed a video of Jordan Peterson in her class. And there were student complaints, and her professor and her supervisor brought her into a meeting, and she secretly recorded it and then leaked it or gave it to Christy Blatchford of the National Post, who then published an article, and all of a sudden there was a huge outcry across Canada. You know, the Globe and Mail and CBC, and like everybody, not only the right, were saying that there was a free speech crisis on university campuses, and this was terrible. There's a few of us who sort of said, well, this isn't really a free speech issue and how we understand it in either of the ways I talked about it, because it's in a classroom, right? So it's academic freedom is the principle, and yet that seemed to go nowhere when academic freedom was mentioned in this debate. It was just free speech and academic freedom. There's no distinction. So I draw on the American literature, people like Joan Walsh Scott and Michael Berube, who make the argument that free speech is not academic freedom. They're different principles. There might be some overlaps. Then I was quite interested to find that actually, more than that in Canada, the Supreme Court has never mentioned academic freedom in relationship to the Charter right of free expression. Yet that connection in the American jurisprudence of the First Amendment goes back to 1925 up through McCarthyism. And so there's that connection, which is firm, right? So there's all these differences between the US and Canada that are incredibly important for us. And even, again, the letter that Anthony Housefather and 4 other Liberal MPs sent to all university presidents to answer. It doesn't make sense in the American context, because the first question was, do you allow calling for genocide on your campuses? Well, in the States, that's not illegal. That's protected speech under the First Amendment. So that question makes sense. Canada doesn't. It's illegal, right? None of those presidents could say, yes, we allow illegal speech on campus, right? So the context matters. So in that chapter, I go through those debates. And then the final chapter is on social media. It's like like many of us these days, I was trying to not deal with it, partially because it's complicated in this realm, but partially because 15, 20 years ago, there was so much hope in social media, right? It was going to be progress and democracy, and some of that relates to free speech, right? Because the idea is, wouldn't it be great if just from our pockets we could communicate with the world? And that hasn't really come about in the way that we had hoped. And this is one of Jason Hannan's book, Trolling Ourselves to Death, is a more thorough examination of those types of things. I had to very much keep myself to this idea that, well, this is a book about free speech, not social media, right? Similarly, it's not a book about academic freedom, it's about free expression. But the argument is, we face this today in terms of the Online Harms Act, where the debate seems to be to regulate or not. And the free speech absolutists say we shouldn't regulate the internet. Number one, it won't be effective. And number two, it would have terrible consequences. And so the chapter sort of points out that that's the wrong question, because the internet or social media is already regulated. Social media would not exist if it wasn't for the much discussed Section 230 of US Telecommunications Act that was written in 1996. And there's a huge debate about that, which I sort of cover a bit. But just to make the basic point that it's already the legal regulations that allow social media not to be like a publisher, like the Winnipeg Free Press, like radio or TV. If I defame you in the free press, you can sue me and the free press, right? Whereas if I defame you over the telephone or in a letter, you cannot sue the postal service or the telephone company, right? So there's a legal distinction between those two, precisely because the telephone company and the post office doesn't intervene in our communication. They are common carriers. They just carry the messages. And Meta is still arguing that that's what they do. And yet obviously they wouldn't make the massive profits that they make if they couldn't intervene with our posts, right? So that whole dynamic is already a regulation, right? It's a regulation that the US then had to force on the rest of the world through trade agreements. So this idea that the question is to regulate or not does go back to the basic sort of simplistic notions of free speech as just the absence of restraint, right? And clearly what we're talking about is already regulated. So then the question is what type of regulation? Now, it's not a book on social media, so I don't have an answer to that question. You can ask me the question, but I will tell you I don't have an answer. So just to conclude, the book is one that I think of as immanent critique. So I'm critiquing the dominant ideas that shape most of the public discussion around free expression. They tend to be from the so-called Western tradition. And there's times that I sort of point that out. I do engage to some extent in David Newhouse's notion of indigenous academic freedom. I engage with John Burroughs, but not like, to some extent it is a very Eurocentric book because it is this process of immanent critique. And I think that is a sort of a huge limitation. And to some extent, my thinking around this is that this means that this book needs to be part of a larger conversation. And if one of the promises of everybody who says they believe in free speech is that it allows new ideas, then it seems to me that the lack of so-called non-Western ideas within debates about free speech is a clear notion that it's failing. So I will end there. Thanks.
Yes. Okay. So I wanted to start first by just thanking and congratulating Peter for having written such a wonderful book, and also for giving me the chance to, to speak with him about this wonderful book. I should say that I think it's extremely well written. It provides a very refreshing, new, scholarly perspective. The distinctions between Mill and Kant and Michael John and C. Edwin Baker, those different purposes of free speech, I mean, those are very useful distinctions. The legal distinctions between the American context and the Canadian context, public speech versus university campuses. These are all extremely helpful distinctions, and on top of that, it's very lucidly written. So I think this is a really wonderful intervention into the ongoing and often noisy debate about free speech. I wanted to start with a very simple question. For those who haven't had the chance to read the book or read the preface, if you could share something about the history of the book, what events, public and personal, prompted you to write it?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I will say that I don't feel like it was a book that I chose to write. Like my other books, I feel like I chose to write this. I feel like it sort of chose me. Some of it was the Lindsay Shepherd case, and I was quite astounded that the president of the University of Wilfrid Laurier, who is a zoologist by training, had the audacity to say, announce to the public sort of an apology to Lindsay Shepherd to say that what you did was fine in our classrooms, and I thought there should have been an outcry around academic freedom because the professors whose classroom it was teaching communications, and that was his training, right? And how academic freedom works according to our collective agreements, is that we're the ones who get to decide what's in our classrooms, right? So that was sort of, percolating there. Of course, it was the age of, I guess, what did they call it before they called it cancel culture? It was consequence culture, then it came into cancel culture. And so all of those debates were percolating. Then the other thing, and actually to some extent it was after January 6th, 2021, when Trump and he actually filed the lawsuits to take Twitter and Facebook to court for canceling his accounts based on the First Amendment. And they were all thrown out of court because, of course, Congress shall make no law abridging free speech is that Congress shall make no law, and Twitter is not a Congress, right? So it was just sort of nonsensical, and yet that is the terrain that we're in. So I sort of thought, I've been teaching John Stuart Mill, I sort of make distinctions as a political theorist, that's what we do, and that's what was missing.
Okay, thank you. Okay, maybe we could start with like a basic conceptual question about how we define speech. So in classical rhetoric, speech was always understood to be oratory. It later expanded to include writing. And we now obviously regard that as an exceedingly narrow idea of speech. We now regard art as speech. We regard, bodily gestures and protests like Colin Kaepernick taking the knee as a form of speech. Which I think is good that we've expanded our idea of speech. But then you also mentioned, for example, in the book, the Citizens United case, which defined money as speech. So when we talk about free speech versus, limiting speech, there's this nagging question of what exactly counts or should count as speech. And I'm wondering how you would define that.
Great question, difficult question. All those examples have a long history, especially with the Supreme Court in the US around, defining, burning crosses on a lawn as speech, right? Wearing a black armband as speech. So that line, and I sort of argue that the American jurisprudence has taken John Stuart Mill's line that if you need to regulate it because it harms other people, then we call it action, whether it's words or not. It's fighting words is in another court case that they explain that with. But I think the deeper, more philosophical answer is sort of the answer to why I never thought I'd write a book like this, because I work on language, and I think, communication and speech is always embedded within a dialogical process with other people, and it's always structured. You need an alphabet, you need I'm very interested in standardized languages and those things that allow us to communicate. And so this idea of this very individualistic notion of free speech is sort of a non-starter, I think, philosophically, and yet obviously politically, it's a hugely important, right? So, I guess the short answer is I would never define speech, because I think speech is part of communication, which is a bigger thing. But I don't think that's how the free speech debates have been carried out.
Okay. Would you or should we then make an argument against the classification of money as speech?
Certainly, I think the Citizen United case is hugely problematic.
Okay. Do you want to elaborate?
Well, to some extent, if we connect speech to equality, then, and to some extent the problem is capitalism, that it obviously gives some people a lot more speech than others, right? So at the same time that we celebrate the internet because all of a sudden we all have such greater access to communicating with each other, that the power of money then means that that is all taken away and it's the wealthy who.
Another question that I have is about it's a materialist question about the political economy of free speech. I'm wondering, is there something to be said about the political economy of free speech? I'm thinking, for example, about the differences between what you can say, for example, in Israeli media, versus what you can and can't say in American and Canadian media, right? So just a few days ago, there was an editorial in Haaretz where they just flat out said what is happening right now in Gaza is ethnic cleansing. That, you know, editorial title would be inconceivable in, let's say, the New York Times or the CBC or one of these, you know, mainstream American or Canadian newspapers. How do we account for that difference between what you can and can't say depending on where you happen to be? Is the distinction cultural, or are there political economic reasons for these differences?
I think there's definitely political and economic reasons, but also organized, institutions that have been working very hard to make, in certain cases, to make things unsayable, or unsayable in certain venues that are going to have a much greater reach. And so we can, the corners of the internet or the, lefty small circulation publications, lots more can be said, or the right wing publication, right? So certainly there's a political economy of speech. And to some extent, the book, is sort of trying to confine itself to how we conceptualize free speech as opposed to trying to analyze what actually happens, right? Which is where your question goes, right? But obviously they're connected, yeah.
Okay, all right, good. So you agree then with Herman and Chomsky?
Well, I think their analysis is a bit overly simplistic, yeah. That would be a longer, certainly the filters, and I mean, to some extent, I think, dare I say, I agree with Antonio Gramsci, who would have a much more thorough analysis of the institutions and also the counter institutions, right? Sort of the magazines and the journals in which radical things are said and people are organized for change, and critique is made. Yeah.
Okay. And then I'm also wondering about the cynical, maybe disingenuous invocations of free speech and ideals like intellectual diversity that are often made in order to push for certain perspectives within, let's say, university spaces, right? So David Horowitz, for example, has argued that universities lack intellectual diversity. They lack conservative voices, and somebody like Nicholas Kristof has agreed with him. He wrote an editorial in the New York Times a few years ago saying, "Yeah, they're right. We actually do lack intellectual diversity." Aside from the kind of, I think the cynical and disingenuous nature of that kind of an argument, is there something to be said about, is there a problem inherent in the idea of intellectual diversity that leads to these kinds of cynical and manipulative invocations of it for these political purposes?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cynicism there is that clearly, I think a lot of people did correctly point out that universities are very homogenous places and there's a lot of diversity that's left out. And then the conservative movement sort of glommed onto that language to describe their feelings that there aren't enough conservative voices within universities. I mean, it's a tricky one to judge because all of the surveys and all of the sort of empirical evidence that's mounted always takes a very sort of facile view of what's left and what's right? And quite often they're talking about who, what party in the US you vote for, and that's their only measure, right? And I would certainly say that, yes, universities are, far too homogenous in their thinking and methods, and we need intellectual diversity, but it shouldn't just be left, right, conservative, liberal, which is how, how it's met out. And that's part of the problem. I think that free speech debates clearly show that because we've been having the same basic debates for decades, right? And yet there's lots of other ideas. I mean, I don't think, and some of the material that I look at does sort of make the claim that the West is defined as the West because it has a monopoly on free speech. And I think that is sort of preposterous and racist. I think Egon Sinclair said 2 weeks ago at the Knowles, Blakey Knowles lecture at the University of Winnipeg, he said, free speech is an indigenous concept. Now, I haven't talked to him about sort of to flesh that out too, but that's, and so I think, yes, universities need to be much more diverse. I'm not too concerned about conservative voices not having space in universities, I see them all over the place, right? So.
Usually in business and economics departments.
Yeah, and some science departments too.
Yeah. So about that last point, you do cite a book. I have not read it, and now I'm extremely keen to read it. The Indian Roots of American Democracy. The Indian Way is a Thinking Tradition. I guess a chapter by John Mohawk. Is that what you're referring to about the indigenous roots of free speech?
No, that was Nico Sinclair who I was referring to just now. But yeah, I mean, there certainly, I guess, in the conclusion, I try to say that there's two issues. One issue is sort of who we take to be the classic standard bearers of free speech that are all within this Western tradition and a very individualistic thinking. But then the other one, and certainly John Mohawk's work and many others, you know, a lot of it is very American about how much the American Constitution was actually influenced by indigenous interactions, right? I don't know much of that's not my area. I sort of want to know more, but and so that, yeah.
Okay. I have a question about social media, having to do with infrastructure. It's not, I mean, it's, yeah, yes, Trump is critical of Twitter. There are lots of people across the political spectrum who are critical of social media on the grounds that it is kind of now a very central space for democratic discussion. It's kind of an integral part of our public sphere, yet it's privately controlled, and there are these kinds of arbitrary exclusions. The guy who now owns Twitter will just delete you if he doesn't like you, that sort of thing, right? My question is, if social media platforms have achieved an infrastructural function and status and role, I mean, not just for commerce, I mean, lots of people are dependent on Instagram for their businesses to survive, but also for democracy in the public sphere, then isn't that precisely a reason to turn them into public services? Is there a danger in, the public sphere being in private hands? And I know there's been a version of this argument about, television.
Right. I was going to say that, I guess the first point is, and people working on social media often, see it as this totally new thing, and yet, obviously the public sphere has been privatized always, like it's never not been private, right? So in that sense, I think we need to be careful about those types of claims. Actually, Alexander Micheljohn is great because he rants against commercial radio in a way that you could just replace radio for social media and it would fit perfectly, because he's so upset because it has such promise, and yet it's commercialized and it's just there to make money, right? And so it sort of fails its promise. Bertolt Brecht also has writes about how if only radio were two-way. The problem with radio is it's one way, so it's authoritarian. And if it's just two-way, and you're like, so I think we need to look at those things. And I try, again, the point of chapter 4 is not to come down with it's not about social media, but outside of that, part of me thinks that yes, right? The answer is yes. I don't know why, and I know why. Right now, if CBC created a social media network, it probably wouldn't do so well, right? That's my guess. Even Blue Sky is not doing so, although actually since last week it's been doing a lot better. But it's private, right? So it has the same business model, and so but I do think that the platform socialist arguments are convincing to me. Yeah.
Okay. Can you elaborate for the benefit of the audience on the difference between the different proposals? I mean, you go into them in some detail. Can't remember his name, the former co-manager or whatever it was of Facebook. Chris something or other. Yeah. Mark Zuckerberg's former friend.
Right. Yes.
The regulation argument, the platform socialism argument, the platform cooperatism argument. What are these different proposals for rescuing social media, let's say?
Right. So, and I mean, it's a fascinating debate precisely because it's so graded in such almost, a very analytic way, right? And that there are many people who argue that the problem with social media today is just it's centralized. And if we had, Mastodon, that whole experiment was trying to decentralize it and give more powers to the consumer so that we can take our lists of friends to different platforms, and that you know, once we do that, that would be clear. To me, that's sort of the liberal capitalist answer. Even before that, we have a more conservative answer, which is sort of the legal arguments that, you know, the law allows us to have certain people who have fiduciary responsibilities, and why don't we have, you know, just like your accountant has a fiduciary responsibility to your wealth, why can't we say that these social media platforms have fiduciary responsibilities to the public, right? And playing around with that type of thing. So that's sort of more in the regulation realm. And then there's the more techie people who are saying, oh, but we have ways that we could make social media decentralized, right? Then you have the doctrinal sort of more radical version of a similar thing. And a lot of these revolve around how, you know, are you an anarchist or a Marxist to some extent? Like, is the state the big problem, or is capitalism the big problem, right? And I think it's important to sort of see what's going on in those debates. Again, you know, I've been thinking about the relationship between Marxism and anarchism for a long time, and I don't think there's a simple answer, right? But I think that that's really what's at the heart of those gradations. You know, I think for good reasons, people would be a bit worried if we relied on social media just like we do today, but it was all owned by the state, right? That's a lot of power in the government, right? And I get that. And so somebody like Dr. O would be opposed to that solution, whereas more of the socialist responses would be like, well, that might make more sense. Although I don't know anybody who's actually proposed that sort of extreme a notion, but there is an idea that it needs to be not-for-profit. It needs to be subsidized by the state, you know, but normally an arm's length is the huge emphasis.
A concept related to this that has kind of started becoming, you know, more and more discussed is the idea of the Fediverse that you talk about in the book. Can you explain what the Fediverse is and what the excitement is supposed to be around it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different proposals, and again, this is sort of not like as a political theorist, I came to a lot of this literature. You know, I was sort of aware of it and then had to sort of delve into it to deal with the free expression question. But I mean, to some extent, it's sort of federalism on steroids, if you want, sort of like an extreme notion of federalism to solve some of and to some extent, they're all trying to solve the same problem, which is the current business model of social media is surveillance capitalism, right? Sort of, and you know, I talk about different ways to conceptualize that. But it is the idea that we're no longer customers, we're users, and then it's our attention and our activity on the online that gets harvested and sold to the advertisers, and that's the business model, which is so harmful, right? And that's why you have Facebook sort of wanting to have an oversight board that sort of make sure it's not really bad, but it's not going to be, you know, they're trying to make a profit, right? And you know, if polarization and hate gets more eyeballs on the screens, then that's what they need to do. That's, you know, to satisfy their shareholders, and that's the capitalist world we live in. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Another social media question, if you don't mind. My question has to do with TikTok and the role that has come to play over the past year, especially among young people, in educating themselves and educating others about what's been happening in Palestine, which I think took a lot of people by surprise. It took me by surprise because I had only nothing but negative things to say about social media until that happened. And so I'm just wondering, has TikTok been fulfilling any of these goods or goals identified by Kant, Mill, Meiklejohn, and C. Edmund Baker?
Yeah, that's an interesting one phrased like that. Like in a certain sense, I mean, TikTok, it's the format, which is interesting. And again, that's not really my area in terms of how it is that format, you know, is so attractive, especially to younger audiences, and then gets used politically, right? Because, you know, Instagram is sort of also very visual and supposed to be sort of not Twitter and not sort of textual and political, but sort of fun and visual, and yet very quickly became politicized. And to some extent, it's, you know, the atrocities in Gaza are you know, you can deny them all you want, but when you see them on the screen, it's right, it's the images that are really effective, right? And obviously there's a huge literature on those questions of images and things. But really, I mean, Twitter, I mean, TikTok is also fascinating because it's so controversial, and now and I don't know, you know, again, it's my ignorance, why the offices in Canada being closed makes any difference to the supposed threat that it poses, right? And I think, you know, and even those details, you know, are obviously important at some level, but I don't think they speak to the larger problems.
Fair enough, fair enough, fair enough. We have 15 minutes. I kind of did want to get to the Stanley Fish question, but I also want to give the audience the opportunity to ask questions, to pose questions to Peter. And this time is going to blow by really quickly. So yeah, questions from the audience. Yes, please, go ahead.
I promised Peter I'd ask questions. So the news that really struck me today, that just sort of totally disheartened me, was to hear that RFK Jr. is going to be leading up Health and Human Services in the United States. One of his big buddies is a guy called Jay Bhattacharya, who is responsible for both horrific and misinformation and disinformation in this pandemic. I'm an occupational health person. I've been paying attention. I'm looking at the alt-right's influence. So I hear the title of your book and I'm thinking, what does this all mean for freedom of expression when we have people who lie a fair bit in charge of things and affecting not just the lives in the United States, but what happens in this country as well and elsewhere?
Yeah, I'm glad you started me off with an easy question. Thanks. Yeah. You know, to some extent, I think that certainly the Enlightenment was very optimistic about reason, and part of that was that, you know, if you read Kant about the public use of reason and John Stuart Mill about sort of all this great knowledge that will come up because if we allow free speech, that's all we need to do. I mean, Kant basically says that, right? He says that the interesting thing about free speech is that it's more important than all other civil freedoms because it will lead to enlightenment, right? So there's a faith that enough, talk about as much as you want about whatever you want, was the phrase he used from Frederick the Great, would be enough to dispel misinformation, right? And I think that that's clearly not the case. So I think that's my only real answer, is that, you know, misinformation, of course, is going to be a problem, but it's a bigger problem if you aren't critical about these hugely optimistic ideas that if we just allow people to speak, we will get to the truth or closer to the truth.
Peter, could you just comment on what I think is the flashpoint issue in Canada at the moment around the IHRA definition and the federal government's rapporteur's report, and just the question of how, from your perspective on free speech, we ought to respond to this, because I do think it's going to be quite consequential.
Yeah. Yeah, again, so I wrote a long section on the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and I won't go to all the details there, but you know, you have to wonder about a definition that presents itself, like the IHRA presented it, as a non-legal working definition. And that in and of itself you would have thought that it wouldn't be adopted by governments, right? So that, you know, that's a huge problem that I point out in the book. I also I mean, it's actually interesting, there's been tons of great information, and Jewish Voices have whole lists of the way in which it's been used to silence pro-Palestinian voices. So it's, hugely controversial, and tons of people who know much more than me and have done much more work on this than I have, but I totally agree with them about those things. It does, I mean, I also point out, maybe it's because I'm a nitpicky grammarian, but the definition itself, I mean, people say it's vague, but it doesn't make sense, because it says a certain perception of Jews which may include hatred. right? Well, which is a non-restrictive clause. So as I say, it's a certain perception of Jews, right? Which obviously, you know, if we're working on anti-racism or any type of discrimination, we know that, yeah, you know, feminists have pointed out for decades that just trying to put women on a pedestal can also be discrimination, right? Can also be hugely problematic. So the whole framing of it seems to me hugely problematic. And then even more so when it gets adopted. I detailed an event at the University of Winnipeg in 2018, My Jerusalem, that was organized by I get the organizations right, but a Muslim organization and two local Jewish organizations, and yet it was accused of being anti-Semitic, right? And it didn't have authentic Jewish voices, right? So, you know, my heart goes out for the anti-Zionist Jewish people and organizations that are being told that they're not authentic, right? So there's a whole bunch of problems in there, and then it does, you know, the whole idea, like it's very rare that governments would adopt, you know, there's no definition of what, you know, racism is used in that sense. So, you know, it seems like a flashpoint, I think you said it correctly. But thanks for the question.
Today, I don't know if you saw, there was a court case, well, the Onion bought, along with Sandy Hook families, bought InfoWars. So I'm wondering, I know your discussion of the role of money in free speech, and I hardly agree with you, but what in sort of countering disinformation and you know, what is that role in sort of the broader, you know, where court cases may not fully fulfill their roles or regulation, what sort of role does that have in sort of a marketplace in a capitalist world?
I had not heard that, I guess. I mean, it is interesting writing a book like this, you realize you have to pay attention to the news much more, you know? And you have to rewrite things, you know, when Twitter changed to X, it's like, oh no, you know. But so that's a really fascinating one, and I, like, from what you just said, that's all I know of it. But what a creative response, right? I guess. And presumably they could do really interesting things, right? So, you know, I mean, I guess obviously we need to struggle against misinformation and disinformation, and you know, organizations are doing that, and we need to do it more. But it is an uphill battle, and I don't think it's the solution, right? And to some extent, I would sort of say that along with that sort of analyses like mine that look at more of the like, how does free speech always then get used as this mask for hate speech? And if we can sort of think through that more thoroughly, that's also what we need to do. But I don't think it's an either or type solution.
Thank you. Well, first off, I really think you should see it because it's been bugging me all day that it literally got bought out by a satire political company. So, and what a beautiful result for what's going on there. He is going down with the fight, so we'll see how that turns out. But my question focuses on, we talk about free speech, but I don't think none of us are really taught or really thought about what is the responsibility of free speech, but also the obligation of free speech for both the speakers and the audience. And even afterwards, what is the facilitation of the responsibility and obligation of dialogue, context, and expression of after that free speech is out there and what it creates? What do you think about those intersectionalities?
Yeah, no, great question, and I totally agree with you. And to some extent, you know, it's a bit too simple, but part of me sort of wishes we could leave free speech up to the legal definition. And I think that's important. And even within that, there is the freedom to listen is also very important. And even you can read John Stuart Mill and say it's actually the freedom to listen, which is almost more important than the freedom to express oneself as an individual. And there's, Frederick Douglass is often trotted out by free speech absolutists as arguing that the freedom to listen is the important thing. But I think what you're getting at, and you can do that from the legal framework, but I think your point about what public discussion actually looks like cannot be framed in that same type of way, and that it is, we're participants in conversation, right? And you need to think, there are times at which, if you say certain things in certain ways, your interlocutors are not going to work with you, and that's fine. It shouldn't be illegal, but it's a consequence. And if you want to reach an agreement, in my book on Gramsci, I have a whole chapter using Gramsci to critique people like Habermas and the ideal speech notions, this idea that, speech is fundamentally cooperative. I think speech always involves power, but I think you're totally right that that's a much different terrain in terms of dialogue and discussion, which doesn't fall into the sort of types of concepts we have with the marketplace of ideas, and the only response to speech you don't like is more speech, and those types of tropes. Yeah, but thanks.
And we do have time for one more question before we turn things over to our host or our guest for special comments. Yes.
It's not the baby asking a question, I promise.
I want to hear the baby's question.
No, I came in a few minutes late, so I apologize if you did address this. And I know we've talked lots of these things, but my question is if you could say just a few things about kind of the conflation or the confusion between freedom of expression and freedom from consequence. Because I find this really interesting, especially I find when you talk to students and stuff like that in the classroom, there's a sense of kind of the freedom of speech means that you can just do whatever, that you shouldn't face any consequences. And again, I think what your book is helping us understand is that's not the case. I'm a labor studies professor, and of course there's all sorts of contexts in which you are free to say whatever you want. You're not going to be in prison, but you can't just go into work unless you have academic freedom and say whatever you want. So if you could just say a bit about, your thoughts on that kind of, I would say, misunderstanding of freedom of speech and freedom from consequence. I know you talked a little bit about cancel culture. It's kind of in that realm.
Right. Yeah, so certainly, in liberal democracies, we have the Charter of Free Expression, which should mean that you don't suffer legal consequences from saying whatever you want, as long as it's not hate speech and it doesn't harm, it's not defamation, it's not libel, it's not copyright infringement, right? There's a whole bunch of things you can't say, but in general, you can piss people off all you want, right? But obviously in workplaces, you can't, right? And academic freedom is that, I would say that it doesn't give us total freedom to say whatever we want, but it means that universities are different places to work at, because when we're at work, we can criticize our institutions, for example, intramural academic freedom, and we need to be able to, in ways that in the corporate private world, we can't. Now, some people say with whistleblowing legislation and certain things in the public service may, but nothing is as strong as academic freedom. The crucial thing that I argue in the book is that in Canada, that where that finds its teeth is our collective agreements. And that's not in the States, it is much more on the legal side as well, right? I don't know so to some extent, I think it is sort of a totally understandable misunderstanding given the current discussion of free speech. But it's also, it's interesting that cancel culture was called consequence culture before people had been listening to that Le Chic song from the 1970s about your love is canceled. That's actually where it came from, and it went up through sitcoms, and it's sort of fascinating when you look at the origins of cancel culture. But obviously, it's interesting because I do point out that somebody like Baker, who's a fundamental free speech absolutist in terms of state interference. He says it should be any hate speech laws. He knows, unlike other people who argue against hate speech laws, they say, well, there's not an empirical connection that we can show between, saying hateful things and doing hateful things. So how can we outlaw it? Whereas he says, no, it's fine. Let's, of course, hate speech hurts people. But then he says that we need to allow it to hurt people because the state should regulate it. And then he says, who should regulate it but public opinion, right? So he's sort of saying that's what we have cancel culture for. Right? So yeah.
I'll now defer to you, Peter, and Jason, if you have any closing comments before we move along to the signing.
Sure, so I just want to reiterate how really truly wonderful this book is. I think I feel like this discussion only really just scratched the surface. We probably could think of a ton of more questions, practical examples, philosophical questions. It's a very thought-provoking book. It will provoke a lot of discussion. Please join me in thanking Peter for talking about a really, really wonderful book.
Thanks for the questions and thanks so much, Jason, for joining us, and thanks all for them.
Thank you so much, both of you, and thank you all for your attention, for your questions, your very thoughtful questions this evening. We will now be moving on to the signing portion of this evening. I'm also still delighted that the event ended with Nile Rodgers' cheek reference, so everything's come beautifully full circle. So Peter will be taking his place just behind the signing table in just a moment. There'll be a moment of beautiful chaos while everybody attempts to get in line right here, and then he'll be signing copies of his book. Please do feel free to get a book signed before you pay for it. Just please do pay for the book at some point this evening. We are enormously grateful to Fernwood Publishing for everything, and of course to Jason Hannan and Peter Ives. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.